Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans.
Parents, please be advised that this episode should be listened to by parents first, before sharing with your children. It's best to listen to the sensitive material in this episode first so that you're prepared to help support your children in navigating the conversations we're about to discuss. So if children are in your presence, please listen to this episode at another time.
Hi guys, welcome back. We're so glad that you're with us today. We are going to be talking about a really important topic. We are going to be talking about how to help your kids navigate a terminal illness or cancer diagnosis with Sara Olsher. She is an author and illustrator, and she has written 11 books about how to navigate a variety of topics around terminal illnesses and cancer. And so we are going to welcome her today, but she also is a cancer survivor. And she has an amazing website. She founded the Mighty and Bright company that helps kids and adults understand and manage their lives more easily using a magnetic visual schedule, which is great, especially for if you're going through cancer treatments or if you are a parent that's going through divorce. And that helps the kids to have predictability. So with that, let's get to Sara.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. Okay. So let's just jump into this. So, when you wrote this book, you've written 11 books actually, which is amazing. And the ones that I especially love and have used for my own life, but also in my practice are Cancer Party, which is fantastic. And When You Love Somebody with Cancer. So let's talk about what motivated you to start this journey of writing books about how to help kids navigate cancer. What's your story?
Well, I started researching. My background is in psychology, but I studied adults.
Yeah.
I think if I had known how interesting kids were, I possibly would have taken a completely different direction. Because when my daughter was 18 months old, I got a divorce and she was not coping. She had really terrible separation anxiety, and I was trying to figure out how to help her. And I ended up taking her to a therapist that specialized in toddlers.
Yeah.
And that was when I started to realize how much kids can really understand about what's going on, and also, how developmentally the whole world revolves around them. So they tend to take things on themselves when something is going wrong and blaming themselves,
Yes.
and how they need things explained to them in a different way. And, just explain to them at all. I think there's a lot of families that are just well, they're little, they don't need to know, or they're fine, or I don't want to take away their childhood, so we'll just not talk about it. I really started to realize, whoa, kids understand so much. So that kind of became the beginning of my getting really interested in kids. And then when I was diagnosed with cancer, my daughter was 6 years old. And I knew from all of the previous research that I had done about kids, she needed things explained to her. And if she could have an actual scientific explanation of what was going on in my body, that would make it less scary for her, because first off, it's honest. So she knows that I trust her to, know what's actually going on. And I'm not going to treat her like a baby who can't cope. And so then she's going to trust me more. And then secondly, and she's really going to understand what's happening, because if you're using a bunch of analogies, or you're kind of skipping over the what of what is going on, it just makes things more confusing.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, I'm going to find a book and I'm going to just explain to her, what's happening in my body so she understands. And I got 6 books from Amazon, and I went to the library, and literally nothing explained what cancer was. Nothing. And I thought, how is this? First off, some of the books were very cute, but they didn't explain what was going on. So there's a great book called Nowhere Hair that explains what happens when you lose your hair to chemo. And at the time, I didn't think I was going to lose my hair, so it was completely irrelevant. But also, it didn't explain why.
Yeah.
And so I thought, huh, okay. And then some of the other books were just like flat out terrifying. Like I don't even know how they got published. Like there was one that was talking about surgery and the doctor was holding like a bloody knife. And I
Oh
it's
my gosh, that would
horrible.
be terrifying. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just thought, you know what? Like I'm not going to use any of these books and I'm just going to come up with my own explanation for what's going on. And so I had studied cancer in college because I have a family history of it and was fascinated by it. So I understood, what cancer was from a scientific point of view. So I thought, how can I kind of explain this? And
Mhm.
I thought, well, if I can explain cell division, and then, why would a cell just like start making copies of itself and like not doing anything? And I thought, well, maybe he's just broken, doesn't know what his job was, and decides to have a party instead. So
Yes. It's such a funny, clever idea, but also like so real about like it is the science of like the cell gets broken somehow, right? And then starts making copies of the brokenness. And then,
exactly.
yeah, and you did such a lovely job of making it so approachable.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't scary and that it could make kids giggle a little bit because again, that takes kind of the fear out of it. And so I also wanted to do an explanation of cancer that could be built on. So when I was first diagnosed, they thought that I just had stage 0 or stage 1. And so I explained, okay, there's these little guys and they're having a party in my breast and we have to take them out because if there's a lot of them, then they start crowding out the cells that are trying to do their jobs. So I'm gonna have surgery. They're gonna take my breasts off, and then there won't be any more cancer cells.
Mhm.
But when I woke up from surgery, it turned out that it had actually spread to my lymph nodes. And so then I had to go back to my daughter and say, okay, actually, there were more guys than we thought. And they'd kind of like packed up their stuff and they were going to move to another part of my body. So I want to make sure that we get rid of all of them. So I'm going to have this medicine that is going to kill them, but it's also going to make my hair fall out and make me feel tired. And so I wanted to make sure that anything that I wrote had kind of a baseline of explaining what it is, but also gave, different avenues for people to explain, different levels of treatment and different types of cancer. So a lot of breast cancer survivors I found were creating resources that were breast cancer specific, and I really didn't want to do that. So it's very general. And then once I did Cancer Party, I wanted to go back. Something about it didn't feel like exactly what I wanted to do. And so what happens when someone I love has cancer came out like a year later. And that kind of took the party aspect out of it because there were some families that were like, it needs to be more serious. Like, I don't want my kids to think there's a party. So I just got rid of the party part, explained them as broken cells, and then took it a step further and explained how treatment affects a child's day-to-day life, and how you can do some coping skills of like showing them what to expect on a calendar. And then all of the other books kind of came from there.
Yeah, which is amazing. And I think you have such a great point in that kids can understand so very much.
Mhm.
And we can be honest with them about a lot of things in a way that is like age appropriate. But if
Mhm.
we don't give them information, they're going to create a story on their own. So if we don't tell them, then they are naturally, because we're so egocentric when we're young, we're thinking mostly about ourselves and how the world is about us. And so we're going to explain it being like our fault or our problem or we did this or I'm bad. And that's not really what it is. And so kids will do that naturally. And we want to protect them. So actually giving them information is protection. So
Yes.
my next question for you is going to be like, do you think it's important for families or kids to be involved in the diagnosing process of cancer? And I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's give families maybe some information about our experiences and how we can bring our kids into those pieces as well.
Yeah, I think there's a line between involving the kids and like bringing them into the chaos and bringing them into the anxiety.
Yeah.
Because when I was very first diagnosed, I think the worst and most horrible part of cancer, wherever you are in the process, is the waiting. And, when I was first diagnosed, I had it was just such a slow process. Like, oh, they think they found something funny on your MRI. Now you wait a week before you get to have the diagnostic ultrasound and mammogram. And then they told me at that appointment, okay, what we're seeing can be nothing other than cancer, but we have to have a biopsy. And then the biopsy took a week to schedule and then 3 weeks to get the results. And it was just like the worst.
Yes.
And so I think you don't want to involve your kids in the stuff that is like really detailed and granular and like overwhelming. I think it can be very confusing when we say age appropriate with no context. Age
Yes.
appropriate basically just means like what can they actually understand of what's going on and tell them that.
Mhm.
Don't just like involve them in your emotional turmoil and, it, bring them into the situation before you even know what's happening.
Sure.
So I waited to tell my daughter until I knew what was actually happening and what the next step was going to be. So I had the biopsy results back and I knew that the next step was going to be surgery and I didn't know when it was going to be scheduled, but I knew, okay, when I have this surgery, she's going to stay with her dad for like 4 days.
Mhm.
So I could sit down and I could say, is now a good time to talk? I have something kind of serious I want to talk to you about. And then explain to her, have you ever heard the word cancer before? Yes, but I don't remember what it is. And then explain to her what it was. And then I say, so that is in my body. I have found some little guys in my breast, and I don't want you to worry because this is what the plan is.
Mhm.
And then when it came back and turned out it needed to be more, then I could say, okay, I had the surgery and they think that they got rid of all the guys, but they had already like packed up and we're going to move somewhere else. So we want to make sure that like no guys got out. So this is what this is going to look like. I'm going to, have medicine and this is what is going to happen. So you don't want, it could have gone, hey, child, I think I might have this cancer thing. And then they're worried, does she have cancer or does she not have cancer? And so you want to make sure that you have some information before you present them with it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times they notice, like, especially if you're having a lot of different appointments, right? Like you're
Mhm.
more absent. So we're going to need to put some explanation behind that because, again, they're going to attribute to themselves. So you could be more vague,
Mhm.
right? Of like the doctors are checking this part out to see if it's healthy, right? It could be nothing, could be something, but I don't know what that is yet.
Yeah.
Even though you may suspect it's cancer, your doctor may suspect it's cancer, we can say we don't know, but it can be confusing and we have a lot of feelings. And so they're also like barometers on our feelings, right? They're kind of like, oh, mom is stressed or dad is stressed or everybody's stressed. So it's like we do need some explanation, but not all of the nitty gritty information is necessary because it makes more confusion and overwhelms them sometimes. I agree.
Yeah.
So what do you feel like you learned about your own child in this process about like navigating a parent with cancer? Like what did you learn about her and maybe children in general?
Yeah, I think so. I really expected her to not handle it well. Because she had really terrible anxiety for basically until she could display anxiety. And I was her person. I still am her person. I'm a single mom and she's with me all the time. And so I really thought she was not going to cope. But it turned out that by explaining to her what was going on, I took the trauma out of it.
Mhm.
She trusted me to be honest after I had the explanation of what was going on. My mom was staying with us and she went to my mom and she said, Mom told me. And my mom said, What did she tell you? And she was like, Well, she has something and I forgot what it's called, but she's going to be fine.
Yeah.
And
You're like, okay, we won this, right?
right. I'm like, okay. Um, so I also learned, this is not a one and done conversation. It's really important to use the word cancer. There were things that came up during my treatment where, one of the things I said to her was cancer can mean a lot of different things. And people are going to have strong reactions when they find out that I have this, because usually it's something that happens to older people, and it can be something like what I have, or it can be something really big and terrible and people die from it. And I want you to know that you and I have had this conversation, and I don't have the big scary cancer. But when people find out, they don't know that. So I don't want you to be scared by their reaction. I want you to remember that we've had this conversation. And anytime you feel scared or worried or have a question, I'm here to answer it for you. So I definitely learned, as time went on, there were things that came up, like her second grade teacher talked to her, and they were doing some project where they were sending gift cards and, written greeting cards to a child that was dying of cancer. And the second grade teacher pulls my child aside and says, "Are you okay? Because that kid has the same thing your mom has."
Oh, ouch, scary. Yes.
So luckily, my daughter was like, because I had educated her about this, she was like, that kid does not have the same thing my mom has. That kid has big, scary cancer, and my mom does not have big, scary cancer. But I just thought, like, had I not prepared her for this,
Mm-hmm.
imagine what that would have been like. And
Well,
also,
meaning, yeah.
right,
I mean, I'm sure the teacher's intentions were like, I want to make sure
right.
this kid's okay. But yeah, I mean, we don't know. Yeah, it's hard when we don't know where families are coming from. And maybe we're not even educated on that.
100%.
Teacher might not have known what kind of cancer you had to ask questions and be curious. And I know that with myself, I wanted people to ask me questions about it so that I could educate them, because
Yeah.
I knew that they were having an impact on my own kids. And so
Mhm.
I talk to families all the time about, in my practice, about also like, let's talk to them about this. Like, we can do this together. Like, let's open the door of communication, because they are going to have more questions. There is going to be things that come up, and they need a soft place to go, right? Like a good place to facilitate these questions. And if you're not the person to do that, like if you're not feeling well or can't handle it, let's name that. Or like, I'm not doing so well today, but like this other person could talk to you about it because you've educated these other people. Or could we talk about this tomorrow? Right? To put a short timeline on that too. But kids are gonna have questions. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and the more people that you can involve in this too, it's helpful for your child, because there were times where she didn't want to come to me and tell me stuff because kids, again, like, she didn't want to upset me. She went to school wearing like a breast cancer ribbon scarf, and she was upset because the kids made fun of her for it. And she didn't want to tell me that. So, she told my mom instead. So the more people you have around helping you, it's not just a benefit to you, it's also a benefit to your kid to have more grown-ups that they can trust.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it might be the school counselor if you don't have family close by, or making sure if you have family, like you've educated them on kind of what you're telling your child and the language, and so that they understand how to talk about it. And if you don't feel good about them talking about it, you can also set a boundary and say, like, hey, if, you know, my child comes to you to talk about this, I'd really like you to redirect them back to me or to this person so that they're getting a consistent story. So we can set boundaries around that too. I think that that's a healthy way too. So is there anything that you in your journey feel like you wish you would have done differently? Um, or that you
Um,
feel like
I
you learned?
I think I'm actually really proud of how I handled it. I think I had the idea to create a visual calendar with my appointments on it after my treatment. So I wish I had had that idea before. I had already created one that was like a co-parenting calendar to explain when she was going to see her dad. So we were using that. But I think it would have been helpful for her to have had my appointments on there, because it was hard for her to keep track of, what was going on. And it also helped to one thing we did do that I thought was really great was we had like a countdown thing where I had a pie chart where every time I would have one of my chemo infusions, we would mark it off because for a kid, 9 months of treatment, it just is like their whole lives. So a reminder that it's going to end at some point was really helpful. But I think to kind of drill down into the day to day would have been helpful. So I do wish that I had done that.
Yeah. I mean, and we always hindsight's 2020, right? Like we can see that back, but you've done so many amazing things with the things that you've learned in your process to help other families and other kids navigate this. I love it. So there's a lot of fear around cancer diagnoses or terminal illnesses. What advice do you have for parents or families in those situations? So like the two of us are lucky in that we are still here and fighting through, right? Like cancers can have reoccurrences and those kind of things. But when there is like a terminal part to this, do you have different advice or thoughts on that part?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work in this space. I've had a lot of friends with metastatic cancer and wanted to make sure that there were resources for people who are living with cancer or who are reaching the end of their life. And my last two books, I partnered with a child life specialist at the Mayo Clinic. We co-wrote a book called What Happens When Someone I Love Doesn't Feel Good. And then the most recent one is called What Happens When Someone I Love Can't Get Better.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when someone I love doesn't feel good is for anybody who's living with a chronic illness or a terminal illness. And basically, it's about setting expectations for your kids about your limitations, energy wise, or what kinds of supports you might have medical wise, and why you're using those things. So, for example, if the lungs aren't working very well, you might get oxygen out of a tank, or if the kidneys aren't working well, you might use, a dialysis machine. So it's about explaining what's going on in a kid-friendly way so they understand it. What happens when someone I love has cancer ends in a very open-ended way. And the reason why is because I want people to be able to explain to their kids if they have a metastatic disease. And that ends with basically some people have cancer that they live with for the rest of their lives. And we will let you know if anything changes or, if anything is, going on. But basically, I'll go to a doctor forever and they will make sure that I'm taking different kinds of medicines, etc. And so I think that book is a great introduction, whether or not you have stage 0 cancer or you were diagnosed with stage 4. And then moving into the what happens when someone I love doesn't feel good, to just kind of set expectations for kids, because there's a lot of excitement for kids day to day. Like they're waking up in the morning, they have 100 things that they want to do. They want to play laser tag. They want to do this. They want to do that. And when you don't feel good, whether you're in the middle of treatment or you have, metastatic disease, like you can't keep up. And there's a lot of guilt from a parent perspective of like, I just can't do all this. And it was inspired because right after I ended treatment, my daughter wanted to go to a birthday party. And we were walking in the heat to a park where we were having a picnic. And then everyone was playing tag, grown-ups included. And then after that, we were going to an arcade. And then after that, we were going to play laser tag. And my daughter said, I knew when you didn't play tag at the park that it was because you didn't have enough energy to do all of those things and you were saving it. And I thought, this is something that I feel like I've done well in explaining this to her so that she didn't get disappointed. Like, how do I help other families with this? And so that book is kind of like let's create a plan A and a plan B. So like, if I'm feeling great, we're going to go to the park and play. If I'm not feeling great, you're going to play board games and I'm going to sit on the couch. So that way you're kind of managing their expectations. And there's not to say they won't still be disappointed, but in being emotionally prepared for it, it doesn't impact them as much. And then What Happens When Someone I Love Can't Get Better is a book about hospice and what happens when end of life is like maybe 2 weeks away. And you don't put like a time frame on what's happening, but you want to explain, what happens when the body doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
And it's not like religious at all. It's basically just like, this is what the life cycle is. This is what you can expect out of it. These are the feelings that might come up.
Mhm.
Um, so there's kind of a progression. So that's kind of how
Yeah.
I said that.
Yeah, that's amazing because I do think that that is hard. And I see families in my practice that do have family members that die from cancer or ALS or some other terminal illness. And it's hard. It's so hard. But if we can give information ahead of time and it's just not something that happens one day and we're giving that ahead of time, it helps them to create that expectation to navigate through even really hard
Totally.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I realized, and especially in talking to Jenny, who was my co-author on those two books, like she deals with this every day in at the Mayo Clinic when people are coming through and she's having to explain, you know, kidney failure or like whatever else to kids. People are leaving their kids out of the conversation because they don't know how to have the conversation. And if they don't have a resource to explain it, that makes it really difficult. So that's the thought behind it is like, let's give people some assistance in having these conversations because the more we can include kids, the more we can, set their expectations about things, the less trauma there is around this. Like, that's not to say it's not going to be horrible. Like, losing a loved one to any kind of illness is horrible. But being kept in the dark about it is adds another layer that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know it's hard for parents to come up with the words, caregivers to come up with the words because they don't want it to be true either. And they're like, we'll just wait. But then it's like sometimes the people don't get better and we need to be preparing our kids for that reality.
Right.
So, I mean, I love all of your work. So I'm so glad that you're here today to share this with us. Tell us, like, what do you really want parents to take away from this conversation that we've had?
I really want parents to know that it is vitally important that we include our kids in these hard conversations. I think the one of the main reasons why this is my passion is because I have a family history of breast cancer. Literally every woman in my family has had it. And my aunt died when she was 41 in 1983. My cousins are in their 50s and 60s now, and no one included them in the conversation. They were left out of it completely. Their choice in how they handled the last year of their mother's life was taken away from them, and they're still upset about it.
Mm.
So, it's never going to be easy wouldn't have been easy for them to lose their mother, but they felt lied to, they felt left out. Um, and it was really traumatic. So I just really feel passionately that we're grown-ups, and as much as we like hate that this is reality and that this is what's going on, we really have to, put on our big kid pants and have the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can ask them too, like, what do you want to know more about that? Like, I found myself in conversations with kids in my practice, but also at my own house of like, do you want to know more about that? Does that answer your questions? Do you feel like you know enough about this? If you don't, come back.
Mhm.
And it's hard for all of us too. So it's going to be hard, but you're going to get through it. And we know that because of all the people who've gotten through it before, but we can do it better. We can not just survive it, but we can like thrive through it. And
Mhm.
it is hard. Grief is a sucky process. It is hard and awful. And even just grieving those times where you can't play with your kid at the park, right?
Yeah.
Like the guilt that we have for that. There's lots of grief around a cancer diagnosis or terminal illness, but we can do it to the best of our abilities. And I know that I say to my kids a lot just as a parent, but also in these times, it's like, I'm just one mommy.
Yeah.
Right. So like I'm still learning here. Right. So like I might say something and I want to go back and I want to say, hey, you know how I said X earlier? I'd like to tell you something a little bit more or different, or I've thought of a better way to say that, or I read online about this, or I listened to this podcast and they said this, I want to tell you about that.
Yeah.
And being able
Yes.
to like go back and edit those things because we are evolving, and that gives our kids permission to also be evolving and to become the person that they're meant to be by claiming, yes, they're just one human and we're going to make mistakes and we can repair. So
Yeah.
I love this all.
Well said.
Yes, yes, I love all of this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you,
I
Sarah, so much for your time today. It was
yeah.
lovely having you, and we will definitely get these books out and share them in our show notes so that people can also look at those resources.
Thank you. Yeah, there's also parent guides at the back of each one of them that like goes into more detail about like how you can set these conversations up and what to do when they ask certain questions or when you have certain questions. So that helps too.
Yeah, I love that. Great. Well, we will get that information out there and include your website too. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Bryce.
Thanks again, Sarah, for all of that information. I know that this is a very sensitive and difficult topic for a lot of families to navigate through, but having a direction is fantastic when we feel like we don't know where to turn, because as a parent, we're not prepared for these things. We don't know what life is going to look like. And sometimes cancer or terminal illness is something that comes to our story, and we need to be prepared. So I highly recommend Sarah's books. I think also for kids, books are great because it helps them to know that they're not alone in this journey, because if somebody would take the time to write a book, it means a lot of people have gone through this experience or will be going through this experience. And so it makes them feel like there's a community around them of people who can understand their experience. I think it's also important for us to remember that kids can understand and can handle information even when it's hard, and that our job is to break it down into something that makes sense and is easy to digest and is also true. And that opens the door for the kids to come back to us to ask more questions, to get clarity, and then they can trust us, which I think is so important in our parenting relationship. With that, I'll say, if you like what we're doing, please rate and subscribe to us, and also send us emails. We're loving the emails and getting the show topics. I'm just loving all the ideas. Thank you. So send those to accidentalexperts@gmail.com, and check us out on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. With that, have a fantastic day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.